Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for taking a little time out of your day to watch the video here. And today I'm going to give you guys what I consider 3 of the top worst pieces of advice that you can take as an angler, and sort of tell you why I feel that way. You know, there's a lot of bad advice you can get out there. You know, bass fishing is sort of like politics. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and with a lot of that misinformation, if it's repeated enough over and over again, a lot of people tend to take it to heart instead of really seeing what the true facts are about it. So I'm going to sort of give you 3 things that I've really found out that are just bad pieces of advice. And you know, a lot of this type of stuff, the things that I'm going to talk about here, I'm not saying that some of it doesn't work some of the time, but most of the time I found that to be poor advice. So real quick here before we get started, just wanted to give everybody the weekly update here. If you guys are interested in becoming members of the channel, it's a great way to support what I'm doing here. Just go on to my YouTube homepage, click on Intuitive Memberships, the little icon at the upper right, and it gives you all the information about that. You know, extra videos every week and access to my personal email address, and it's a great way to support the channel if you like what I'm doing here. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about, you know, what I think the three of the worst pieces of advice you can really take as an angler. First one I want to talk, there's actually 2 of them that has to do with, you know, getting bites and hook sets and that type of stuff. The first one has to do with the bad piece of advice. It's like, as soon as you feel a bite, you need to set the hook. This is really a bad piece of advice, because a lot of people say, well, I need to use braided line, or I need to use this or that so I can detect the strike and, you know, not have the fish spit the bait out. Guys, bass do not spit baits out very often. The only bait categories that a bass will bite real quick and spit out sometimes are things like big swim baits. But for the most part, if you're fishing any type of a slow bait, like a jig, shaky head, Texas rig, anything like that, wacky rig, if you get a quality fish on, or a decent fish, that bass is going to swim forever with it before it lets it go. It may never let it go. It may just swallow the bait. So first piece of bad advice is setting the hook too soon. Instead of setting the hook when you get a bite, the rule that I found that gets me more fish in the boat is if I feel a strike and I let that fish swim anywhere between 4 to 5 feet with it before I set the hook. 4 or 5 feet is sort of a good range to where the bass will take that bait a little deeper, yet it doesn't swallow the bait. So first piece of bad advice is setting the hook as soon as you feel it. Okay, number 2, the second piece of bad advice that I get, or worst piece of advice, is guys setting the hook too hard on baits. If you see a lot of guys setting the hook, and I see a lot of younger guys doing this, when they get a bite, they just jack that fish as hard as they possibly can. I don't care if it's a jig or Texas rig or spinner bait or whatever. They set that hook as hard as they can. They reel that thing as fast as they can and try to boat flip them. The whole concept, guys, I'll talk a little bit about boat flipping. The whole concept about boat flipping is ego. A lot of it is. You hear there's a lot of younger guys out there that think it's cool to boat flip a fish, and it's not cool. Boat flipping should be reserved for times where that fish is going to get you hung up and you don't have any time to mess with it and you need to swing it in. But most of the time you don't want to boat flip. You want to just reach down, lip it, or net it. But back to the worst piece of advice about the hook set is, don't feel like you've got to hammer that hook home. The key, guys, is setting the hook on a tight line. I don't care if you're using a Carolina rig or a jig or a shaky head or jerk bait or whatever like that. Don't ever set the hook hard. Number 1, don't ever set it on a slack line. And instead of setting the hook hard, guys, pull into the fish and reel and keep that pressure on the fish as you're reeling. That pressure that you put on that fish by pulling that line tight will continually drive that hook into that fish's mouth more, and it doesn't tear a hole in the fish's mouth. A lot of times what happens is when you set the hook hard, you actually tear a hole in the fish's mouth. Fish will jump and you'll lose that fish. So worst piece of advice, guys, is setting the hook too hard. Number 2. Number 3 is using braid to fluorocarbon on spinning rods. Now, we've talked about this before, and I'll reiterate the thing, guys. I think that using braid to fluorocarbon is a terrible piece of advice, because number 1, it's not going to get you any more bites. In fact, it's going to take away bites. If you're fishing clear water, you've got a 6 or 7 foot leader on yellow braid, don't tell me that the fish cannot sense that braid is in there or see it. They can detect a minnow and eat a minnow in the dark. You can't tell me that they can see a piece of 15-pound test yellow braid in the water 6 feet above them. Braid to fluorocarbon is going to cost you bites. Number 2, the bad thing about braid to fluorocarbon is you got two you got 2 weak links. I have seen it personally. The braid to fluorocarbon deal cost me winning the US Open 3 years ago at Lake Mead. If my co-angler hadn't broke off a 3 or 4 pound smallmouth on his braid to fluorocarbon, I'd have won that tournament. I've seen it happen over and over again. You have 2 weak links on there. So in my opinion, braid to fluorocarbon is one of those deals, like we talked about with misinformation. It's gotten talked about over and over and over again. People think you need to do it because other people do it. It's bad advice. Go with straight fluorocarbon 99% of the time, or 95% of the time. I do use straight braid sometimes on spinning outfits, throwing like little small buzz baits, floating worms, that type of stuff, where I'm keeping it on the surface. But for the most part, braid to fluorocarbon, in my opinion, is a bad piece of advice. I know a lot of guys will disagree with that, but prove me wrong. I've never had any problem with straight fluorocarbon. I think it gets you more bites. I think it's a lot more efficient. I think that you get better bait action on your lures. I just think it's the way to go. So anyway, guys, that's just a real quick thing. There's a lot of bad information out there. That's my 3 right there, not necessarily in any order. And there's probably others I can think about that may even be more important. But, basically just worst piece of advice you can get is setting the hook too soon, setting the hook too hard, using braid to fluorocarbon. So just wanted to throw that out there, guys, for today's tip. I can promise you, if you do that, if you wait longer before you set the hook, if you pull into those fish and reel and not set the hook hard, and if you go to straight fluorocarbon, you are going to get more bites and land more fish. I can promise you that. So hope it helps out. We'll talk to you guys later. See you.